Welcome, Whiskey Theologians. Today we'll be drinking Redemption Rye this time, and we will be continuing our series on the Intertestamental period, today focusing on the conquest of Alexander the Great. So sit back, relax, pour yourself a drink, and let's get into it. So I have with me today something I'm very excited for. Redemption Rye. And this is actually the rye that I have this time. So the name is very fitting. This is my redemption from thinking high rye bourbon was a rye. So I'm really excited. I've kind of fallen in love with the high rye, and so I'm really excited to try just the rye. The mash bill on this one, since I know I talked about the mash bill on the last one, is 95% rye and 5% barley. So I don't know. Quite frankly, I don't really have any whole lot else to say about this other than I'm excited for my redemption, and I hope I enjoy it. If I enjoy this half as much as I enjoyed the high rye, I will be absolutely pleased. So, without further ado, cheers. It's good. So with the high rye, it had, if you remember, it was just sweet on the whole palate, and then it finished with kind of a herbal spicy note. So what I was expecting with this one is that it would just be just that herbal spicy note all the way through. And it is. There's a lot of that herbal spices sort of thing. It's a little bit different. It's definitely more pronounced. It's on the palate rather than on the finish. Um, it's a long finish. I feel like I'm still tasting it in a lot of ways. What I'm also getting there, which I wasn't expecting, who knows, maybe it's the barley. I don't know enough about this kind of stuff. But I'm getting that I wasn't expecting is a real malty flavor. It's kind of like this tastes like what a brewery smells like, if you know what I'm talking about, right? That that yeasty, malty smell that you get from breweries. It just pervades the atmosphere. It's a wonderful smell. Um, the finish on this tastes like that smell. You can kind of smell it in there too. So that's a little bit of the sweetness, but almost immediately washed over with kind of those warming spice notes. I'm enjoying it so far. So who knows? Maybe, in fact, I am very much planning on bringing this back and the other, the Redemption High Rye, and tasting them back to back, kind of doing a comparison between the two. And I'll do that during this series as well. Plenty of episodes to do here. What I don't think I will do is only drink Redemption during the intertestamental period. I mean, I know they have a bourbon, and I know for their baseline. From what I understand, Redemption has a Redemption bourbon, high rye bourbon, and Redemption rye. That's kind of their baseline, right? Their floor, if you will, entry level stuff. I think they have a kind of barrel select of all of these, and I think they also have some other fancier bourbons. But one, want to finish this a little bit more quickly than I want to buy all of those. And two, they're only going to get more expensive as we go up. And quite frankly, this is not expensive. I think I got this one for somewhere in the vicinity of like $20, $25, something like that. Which, at least so far, I can guarantee you, they all cost the same, the base. I can guarantee you that the high rise 100% worth that. So far, I'm enjoying this one. Not quite as much. I think there's something about that sweet and herb spice that comes back. But there's more going on in this one, definitely. The high rye is interesting, but it's not incredibly complex, right? It's just kind of sweet and then spice, very rounded, well rounded, very agreeable. This one It's a little bit more oomph to it. There's a little bit more going on. No, I keep going back to it, but yeah, it's interesting. I'm enjoying it. I think it will. I expect that this will also be a very good value. I was about to say value bourbon, but a value rye, a um, value drink for the collection. So worth a try, I think. And if you've had it, if you've enjoyed it, leave a comment down. Let me know what you thought about that. So let's get into the class for today. Now, kind of a warning going. It's not a warning. What is it? A disclaimer before we begin. This will be an incredibly fast overview on Alexander the Great. You can take entire college courses on Alexander the Great and not cover everything. So I'm going to go fast here. Additionally, I think I have everything right here. Some of my dates might not be quite right, and I'm definitely oversimplifying a lot of stuff. Again, because of how quickly I'm going through it. So if you're really interested in Alexander the Great, look into him more. There are plenty of books written about him. There are even some ancient books written about him. Well, let's get in. If you've never heard of Alexander the Great, he wasn't quite a Greek. He was a Macedonian. What the exact relationship between the Greeks proper, and the Macedonians was, I don't exactly know. I know they didn't like Alexander and his father, King Philip. That was mostly because of wars that were going on. But Alexander was a Macedonian. His father was King Philip. We're going to talk, I think, in reference to him as we go through, if I remember correctly. But at a young age, Alexander became king when his father died or was killed. I'm not entirely sure. In his early life, Alexander the Great was famously tutored by Aristotle. Pretty high marks on who's teaching him. Oh, by the way, we are covering in today's class roughly 334 to 323 BC, although there was at least going to be one reference, I know, to 335 BC. So roughly those years. Quite frankly, I keep saying roughly those years just in case I just totally screw up a date. I can say, oh, well, roughly. I do understand that I'm saying roughly and then giving very specific numbers. But that's just to cover myself if I do something stupid. Which, this is the internet, so I'm sure someone will let me know if I do something dumb. And if I did, I'll be the first to admit this isn't, I'm not an absolute, I am not the expert, especially in Alexander the Great. But early in his life, Alexander became king when his father, King Philip, died. He spent the first year of his reign at war with the Greek city-states, as I mentioned. This was in the year 335. And that war ended with the complete and total destruction of the city of Thebes. This destruction, whether or not it was what Alexander wanted to do, I think if I remember rightly, I did the research for this a while back. I think there's some debate as to if the destruction of Thebes went exactly how Alexander wanted. I think he did, because he accomplished quite a few things when he absolutely smashed Thebes into the ground. Mainly, he annihilated any thought of a Greek uprising, which was going to be very important for him because Alexander was about to leave Greece, never to return. So he didn't want a war back home. But Alexander was about to leave Greece to invade Persia, which he saw as his divine right. He saw that as his destiny. It was his dream. And I think you know by now, he did. He succeeded, quite famously, in fact. And Alexander's conquest of Persia, what we now roughly call the Middle East, really marks a new epoch in the Middle East. It marks a complete and total shift in the era. The ending of the first era and the beginning of the second. Because from the dawn of time until Alexander went busting through, again, what we call the Middle East, it was always under control of what we would call Eastern powers, right? Persians, Assyrians, Babylonians, etc. But when Alexander came through, he brought it under Western influence. And it would remain under Western influence until the Islamic conquest, although it wasn't always under, certainly wasn't under Alexander's control for that whole time, nor was it even under Greek control for that whole time. And what we call the beginning of this era that Alexander inaugurated is the Hellenistic period. And the Hellenistic period began with the conquest of Alexander, and it doesn't really have an end date because well, we can kind of mark this is when Alexander invaded, this marks the beginning of the Hellenistic era. The Hellenistic era didn't end abruptly. It kind of slowly faded out into the distance. It slowly faded away as Roman influence came in and kind of seeded itself over the Hellenizing influence, although Rome itself was largely Hellenized. So again, you can't really mark a hard end date for the end of the Hellenic age, although I'm sure there is an end date for that. And if there is, just take that as the end date. So, Alexander leaves Greece in the year 334 BC. If you're an Iron Maiden fan, you already knew that. So he leaves in 334 BC and began just utterly destroying the Persian satraps. I think it's pronounced satrap, might be satrap, not entirely sure. And in defeating them, began restoring local rule to the areas that were subjugated by Persia. So a little bit of a note as to how massive empires ruled in the ancient world. You can keep this very brief. Essentially, the way they ruled, for the most part, again, Alexander kind of changes this a little bit, or at least attempts to, is the empire would come through, would conquer the land, and then for the most part, you would relocate the elite, the high and the mighty. You take the best of them back home, but you distribute the people who might cause revolts. And everyone else you just left there, you let them do whatever they were already doing, except now they send taxes to you. And that's how rule worked. And in large part, this is how Alexander, at least at first, would rule. And, oh, by the way, you would insert your own governors. Sometimes they would raise up a local governor, but not often. So the satraps, or satraps, were Persian governors of local cultural and for the most part, they were left to their own defense. There was, especially in the case of Persia, something vaguely approaching a national army, but mobilization was very slow back then compared to modern standards, right? So an army in Damascus or, any of these other large cities that might be, royal or imperial troop units. They'd take a long time to get to the frontier if there was an invader. And so the satraps would have their own local soldiers, their own local troops, their own local armies, and they would just be in charge of the defense of their area, at least until the emperor or the king or whoever it was that with bigger army could come through if the satrap wasn't able to handle it, which is exactly what happened. After these satraps were just being absolutely annihilated by Alexander the Great, Darius left with an army to reinforce what's known as Asia, which, if you don't know your ancient geography, Asia in ancient texts is what we call Turkey nowadays, the Anatolian Peninsula. So when Darius goes to reinforce Asia, that's what he's going for. By the way, when Alexander the Great cuts through that Gorgon's knot and he's to become the master of Asia, might be just referring to Turkey, Anatolia. Probably is referring to more than that. But Alexander certainly saw his empire extending to and beyond the Indus, but that's neither here nor there. Darius decides to go and defend his frontier against Alexander after Alexander wins the Battle of Granicus, which I have no details on, but Wikipedia has tons of stuff on all these battles. So if you want to know more, go to Wikipedia. Start there, and then you can expand out from there. I'm pretty sure I've spoken about Wikipedia on this channel before. If I haven't, ask me in the comments or ask me in person when you see me. In the year 333, then, Alexander wins one of his first real major victories, and that is the Battle of Issus. Again, as I go through, there's a whole footnote, asterisk, whatever you want to say. I think I'm pronouncing all these names correctly. I very well may not be. I think that this word is pronounced, this battle is the Battle of Issus. It could be Issus. I don't know. If you know, let me know, because I like learning things. Now, we don't know the full makeup, but from what most of the sources say is that Alexander had an army of 40,000 men, most of these men being phalanx troops with a contingency of cavalry, and as well as a contingency of peltists, slingers, bowmen, that sort of skirmishing units. This, when I taught this in my congregation, is where I went on a truly massive rabbit trail talking about phalanx units and battle in the ancient world. I'm not going to do that here. If you are interested, go to some other YouTube channel that will do a better job. Or again, Wikipedia is your friend. If I happen to, in the future, I don't have anything in mind, but if I happen to run into a great YouTuber that kind of nails a lot of these battle tactics of the ancient world, I'll put links in the description. Because like I said, there are people who are way better at this area of history than I am. But essentially, I think how I described a phalanx, if you don't know and you don't feel like looking it up, I think how I described it to my members was a phalanx is, very basically put, a hedgehog of death. Think of, or a porcupine rather, a porcupine of death. How the porcupine has lots of spines coming out, well, of its back. Think of that, but with massive pikes and very, very angry Macedonian men that don't like you. That's roughly a phalanx. Most of the sources agree that Alexander probably had about 40,000 men in his army. The size of Darius's army varies, however. Contemporary reports, which again are all on Alexander's side, say that Darius had roughly 600,000 soldiers. Possible. I mean, if Alexander is the one who won, wouldn't you want the army that he defeated to be as big as possible? So it could have been that Darius's army was 600,000 men. It's certainly more romantic to think that, or heroic rather, on the part of Alexander to think that Darius had 600,000 men that Alexander defeated with 40,000. Chances are the number is probably closer to 60,000 men, which still makes Alexander outnumbered. Don't get me wrong, but by a much smaller margin. You can choose to think however you want, because everyone who has a personal stake in it died over 2,000 years ago. So you don't need to worry about hurting their feelings by getting it wrong. So Alexander wins this battle. It's really good. I'm really enjoying this whiskey. Alexander wins this battle, and he captures some important captives. Namely, the mother, wife, and children of Darius. Now, you may be asking, why are they there? They're probably there to watch their dad/husband kill those pesky Greeks. Didn't go well for them. We'll see that sort of thing happening again in the future. Additionally, it wasn't uncommon for families to follow soldiers in the train and be present with even the soldiers, especially the generals, would often take their families in vows. And this extends up until modern times. not uncommon for there to be a large number of civilians following armies as they're going. It wasn't terribly uncommon. However, Alexander, you may note, did not capture Darius. And that's because while Alexander was capturing Darius's family, Darius heroically ran away. I think there's a song about that some British people sang on a great movie a while ago. Brave King Darius ran away, abandoning his family to save his own skin. Now, the Battle of Issus marks what is effectively the beginning of the end of the Persian Empire. They're not done yet, but they're getting there. After this battle, Alexander turns his attention to the coast for all sorts of logistical reasons that don't matter to us today. And he begins this assault on the coast with the destruction of Tyre, which is a super fascinating battle, absolutely brilliant military engineering on the part of Alexander. We're not going to talk about it. Again, Wikipedia, your friend here. From a theological perspective, we're going to see Alexander fulfilling a lot of Old Testament prophecies. This being one of them, the destruction of Tyre being a fulfillment of Old Testament prophecy. Now, while Alexander was besieging Tyre, because it took him a while to take Tyre, if you look up the siege, you'll very quickly understand why. Alexander sent emissaries out to the surrounding area requesting provision and auxiliaries from the locals, saying, hey, join me and I won't kill you later, is kind of how the message went. Some of these emissaries went to Jerusalem, asking Jerusalem to send auxiliaries and to send supplies to Alexander's army to keep them going. Now, at this point, the high priest is effectively in charge of Jerusalem. He's kind of the guy ruling there, and the high priest refused. He refused Alexander's emissaries out of loyalties to King Darius. Again, remember, the Jewish people were very loyal to the Persians for having released them from their captivity and allowing them to return home. And so the high priest refused. At which point Alexander threatened to teach them a lesson in where their loyalties should lie, just as soon as he was done killing everyone in Tyre. When he did kill everyone in Tyre, he officially ended the Phoenician naval dominance in the Eastern Mediterranean, a dominance that they had held for centuries beforehand. At which point, Alexander turns his attention to another city that was a thorn for him and a major city to take. City that is, well, that goes by the name of Gaza, something that does come up in the news every once in a while nowadays. And more or less, Alexander also destroyed Gaza as he moved inland. We mention it here because more biblical prophecy is being fulfilled in the destruction of Gaza. And after Alexander destroys Gaza, he turns his army toward Jerusalem. Now, here's where we're going to have a branch in the story. We're going to go first down the branch that Josephus gives us, the description and the account that Josephus has of Alexander's interaction with Jerusalem. And after that, we're going to go with, quite frankly, a more historically accurate account of Alexander's interactions with Jerusalem. But it's important to kind of see how Josephus is functioning, and there are going to be some implications pushing forward even to Josephus's own day, where he's kind of dealing with the Great Jewish Revolt against the Romans. That's for another class. That's what I told my members too. So who knows? I might be leveraging to do another history class, but I don't have any plans at the moment. So according to Josephus, Alexander approached Jerusalem, and as he was on his way there from Gaza, the high priest, whose name was Judah or Jehuda, I think I've spelt it more than one different way in my notes. Currently, in my notes, the name is spelled Juddua or Jaddua. I don't think that's how I spelled it the whole way through. Anyway, the high priest, Jauda, however you pronounce his name, ordered Jerusalem to repent and pray for deliverance, which is a good thing. It's kind of everything they didn't do in the Old Testament. The high priest is directing the people to turn to God for their salvation rather than anyone else, right? He doesn't send emissaries to Darius to help him. Instead, they turn to God. The story then goes that the high priest was then told in a dream by God to open the gates to Alexander when he came and to welcome him in with full regalia, decorate the walls, line the streets with, essentially allow for a parade for Alexander to come in, surrender the city to Alexander, more or less. Now, when Alexander then approached the city, the priests went out in procession to meet him, fully dressed to the nines, right? Wearing all the robes, all the regalia, there to welcome Alexander to the city. Quick pause here. I think that this is probably accurate up until this point. I suspect that the priest, whether he was warned in a dream or not, I don't know. I suspect the priest is realizing that if Alexander wants to, he will kill everyone there. And I think he's trying to butter Alexander up a little bit. So I do think everything so far is accurate. This next part, however, I very much suspect is an apocryphal story, and I think I'll give you why I think Josephus wrote it into his history. Because as this procession came out, when Alexander saw the high priest and he saw him on his breastplate wearing the name of God, Alexander fell down upon the ground and worshiped the God of Jerusalem. Doesn't sound like Alexander the Great to me, but this is Josephus's account. Now, when his generals saw Alexander doing this, they reasonably asked if he had gone mad, at which point Alexander responded, no, I have not gone crazy. Rather, while I was still in Macedon, planning this invasion, Alexander explained that he had seen a vision of that man, the high priest of Jerusalem, who in a dream encouraged him to quickly invade and conquer Darius, as it was the will of God. It was this vision of Alexander that gave him the courage and the initiative to begin the conquest. And herein lies why I think Josephus has included this particular account. And he's very clever about it, too. You'll see that Josephus is using this story to bring Alexander, someone who the Romans honored as a near god, if not a god, under the auspices of the God of the Jews. Now, with this sense of, well, he was only successful because our God wanted him to be successful. Kind of with the implication, if you want to be successful, don't kill us all, which is very much the occasion upon which Josephus was writing. But he's doing this also in a way which lets Alexander remain this grand hero. So there's a tension there. It's a very clever rhetoric device, which again, I think Josephus is included to save his countrymen in the Great Jewish Revolt, or really the aftermath of the revolt. At which point, after explaining that he wasn't crazy, Alexander was then led into the city, and at which point he was shown the book of Daniel, which is where a number of these visions not the ones we've talked about, but other visions that most people agree are about Alexander the Great. And he saw himself as the one who was prophesied to destroy Persia. And upon seeing this, he asked for the high priest to request a favor. Now, Jaddua, I guess I do still have it spelled this way, then requested that the Jews would be allowed to practice the laws of their father and be exempted from taxes every 7th year. At which point Alexander agreed and left Jerusalem. This is then followed in Josephus by what is, quite frankly, a racist account of the Samaritans and a condemnation of their, to kind of use Josephus's thoughts, deceptive two-faced practices. Josephus accuses the Samaritans of pretending to be Jews when it suited them and hating the Jews when it didn't. Josephus very, very clearly here is viewing the Samaritans as lesser and even wicked in comparison to the Jews themselves. Now, all of this so far, the only historian who talks about it is Josephus. It's almost certainly an apocryphal story. But as I said, I think it does teach us a little bit about how the Jewish people viewed their role in history, how they're defending themselves against what Rome. I think that's a lot of Josephus's influence going on. And I think it also kind of shows their mindset, how they viewed, like I said, themselves in history. Are you ready for the, in all likelihood, more historically accurate version of Alexander's invasion and time in Judea? Well, it goes like this. Alexander conquered Judea in the year 332. He encountered no resistance, apart from Gaza, which again is prophesied in Zephaniah as well as elsewhere. And then he passed through the area quickly and largely uneventfully. The end. We really don't have a whole lot of history of what Alexander did in Jerusalem. Again, he probably was welcomed into the city. I doubt he bowed down. I quite frankly doubt he saw a vision of the high priest giving him God's blessing over his invasion of Persia, but who knows? Maybe. Again, it's just unlikely. At this point, we're almost near the end of the Jewish involvement, specifically with Alexander the Great. We got a little bit more, but I think it's worth finishing Alexander off, again, in very broad brushstroke review. After conquering Judea, Alexander then went south and invaded Egypt, which immediately surrendered. They saw, the Egyptians, that is, saw Alexander as their savior from Persian rule. Remember, last time we talked about that military camp in Elephantine, which was there to keep the Egyptians in line. Just as the Jews saw the Persians as liberators from Babylon, the Egyptians saw Alexander as liberators from the Persians. We kind of see a lot of that type of flip-flopping going on, kind of depending on which side you are on. And so, yeah, the Egyptians saw Alexander as their liberator and were overjoyed to welcome Alexander in. And Egypt would really become one of the major centers of Hellenic power after Alexander died, essentially. In the year 331, Alexander founded Alexandria, at least the Alexandria you think of when you hear that term. I don't know what the number is, but Alexander named like 30 or something cities after himself. There's Alexandrias, there's Alexandretas, there's, I think, just Alexanders out there. He liked naming cities after himself. He did it a lot, but the major one is, of course, Alexandria in Egypt, and that was founded in the year 331. Interestingly enough, the Jews were allowed, or even were given a place of enormous prominence in this city, in the city of Alexandria, which will come up more in, I believe it's next week's lesson. Well, in October of that same year, 331, Alexander defeated Darius once again at the Battle of Gaugamela. This defeat of Darius and victory of Alexander marks the end of the Persian Empire. And at this point, Alexander then goes about restoring the Babylonian temples. Note the similarities to Cyrus. He's essentially going to the people that the Persians overthrew, giving them power so that they like him. Again, it's a massive area of land. I mean, from Greece to the Indus River, Alexander eventually conquers. He needs a way to keep everyone liking him so that he can remain in control. And so one of the ways he does that is by restoring the Babylonian priests. Oh, and the Babylonian temples as well. So at this point that Alexander begins to move east. And as he moves further east, we see really a marked shift within Alexander and, quite frankly, within the troops, but mostly within Alexander himself. As he continues to move east, Alexander more and more relinquishes his insistence on Hellenization, which we're going to talk about Hellenization plenty in this class. There's no reason to do more today. Again, Wikipedia is your friend if you need to know now. But Alexander relinquishes his insistence on Hellenization more and more and begins adopting Eastern practices more and more as he goes. He begins to really blend the two in his own personal life, and we'll see that he does attempt to do that, impose that blend on others. He continued his Eastern conquest into what we now call Afghanistan, Russia, and Turkmenistan, and even began a foray across the Indus into India, which famously his troops didn't follow him. And Alexander wanted to keep going, and quite frankly, he probably could have kept going. It's one of those great questions of history. Would Alexander have been able to conquer India? Kind of like what would have happened if Alexander went west instead of east? What would the world look like today? We'll never know, but it's something historians talk about over a drink because it's fun. Alternative history. It's interesting, if not utterly pointless. But a lot of fun things are utterly pointless. That's okay. So he began his foray into India, but his troops didn't follow him. There are a number of reasons. His troops are war weary. They've been fighting a lot. They're ready to get back home to not only their families, but also their promised riches and land. And quite frankly, at this point, they're leaving loot behind. The main way soldiers were paid, and especially in the ancient world, was by what they took off of dead people. And so when you can't carry more things off of dead people, the motivation for going to fight and possibly becoming one of those dead people yourself drops dramatically. And they, quite frankly, couldn't take any more loot with them, and so the soldiers had no real monetary motivation to keep going. And what may be underestimated here is that the troops are not a little irritated at Alexander's Eastern habits. They are Greeks. They don't like the fact that their king is slowly but very much surely not or morphing out of being a Greek and being more like an Eastern ruler. They don't like that, and so all of their motivation is gone. They essentially tell Alexander, you can go fight in India all on your own. We're going home. And so Alexander wisely turns around. On this return voyage, he goes west and begins a program not of Hellenization, but of what at least I don't know if others call homogenization, which is just, both are distinct, right? Both this homogenization policy and the Hellenization policy is distinct from what people had done before. In the past, the Persians, Babylonians, Assyrians, or the Neo-Assyrians, the Assyrians, all these guys allowed individual communities to remain effectively autonomous as long as they were paying taxes. Alexander wanted a homogeneous empire. Initially, that was a Hellenic empire, but as he, especially is on his return trip, he's willing to kind of merge and mix together Eastern and Hellenic practices, which makes him not terribly popular with really anyone, right? No one is happy other than Alexander with this new policy. Well, in 323, Alexander dies of either a fever or, far more likely, poisoning. He was almost certainly assassinated, killed with poison at the age of 33, just 13 years after rising to the throne. I don't know how much you have completed by the age of 33, but it's probably less than Alexander did. I mean, just in his own lifetime, but of course he has a massive historical impact. While he did begin to bring in this more homogenous policy, he is responsible for the spreading of Hellenic culture. There's just no two ways about it. Additionally, the line between Greek and at least what the Greeks considered barbarians began to blur. The Greeks were far more willing to speak with people who weren't Greeks, which becomes important from a gospel perspective because the Greeks were willing to listen to Jewish individuals because they didn't necessarily see them as barbarians. Well, at least they saw them as less of barbarians than they would have pre-Alexander. Um, Greek then becomes the lingua franca. This is why the New Testament is written in Greek. This is why Jesus and all the disciples spoke Greek. Essentially, if you were doing business, you were speaking Greek. When the Romans were in Jerusalem, they weren't speaking Latin, nor were they speaking Hebrew or Aramaic, which of course Aramaic is Hebrew's mostly gone out of fashion, even by the time of Alexander. The Romans and the Jews, when they interacted with each other, did so in Greek, much to the chagrin of many people who have great Latin quotes from the Passion narrative. Pilate would have been speaking Greek to Jesus, not Latin. But let's keep those Latin phrases around because they're too good to let go of. Additionally, and I didn't know this until I did this class in particular, Alexander opened up sea trade routes between Europe and India. So trade had already begun with Alexander. And then, for the interest of our class, the last lasting influence that we're going to talk about is that the conquest of Alexander initiated greater Jewish dispersion. However, this was what I call positive dispersion rather than negative. And what I mean by that is that the Jews were not forcibly distributed and dispersed across the world, but rather chose to move, chose to leave Jerusalem, travel all over the world, at least the known world, at least Alexander's empire, and they spread, well, the scriptures. They spread knowledge of God, the promises of Jesus. It's not surprising that people who aren't Jews were looking for the Messiah, i.e., the Magi. May or may not have been looking for the Messiah, but they at least knew the Hebrew scriptures enough to recognize a sign of the Messiah. And we're going to see that this becomes a massive influence, really in Acts and further on down the road. But this the spread of the Jewish, again, a willing diaspora, if you will, kind of paved the way for the gospel, again, pertaining to our class here. Well, I hope you enjoyed. The next time we get together for this, for the intertestamental class, we will talk about the aftermath of Alexander's death. When he died, he left a massive power vacuum and some craziness ensued. So we'll talk all about that next week. But until then, all you who wait on the Lord, raise a glass as we drink to Christ's imminent return. Cheers.